Ahoy! My name is Emily. I work over at the Clever Branch. Today we are going to go across stitch the 7 C's. We're doing a bit of a cross stitch project, but what I'm going to show you, not an entire cross stitch. We do not have all day, but I will show you basically the sewing skills you need to get started. In your kit, you're going to find this embroidery hoop. You can actually put your fabric on it to start with and embroider from there. What I'm going to do is a little bit easier for me, just to, work a sampler video. But you've also got your fabric. It's called Aida cloth. It is a starched, loosely woven fabric. So you're going to need a needle, but it doesn't need to be a very sharp one. You aren't piercing the fabric for most of it. You are just going through the little holes that are already in it. This is a finished prototype for one of the patterns that I have created. If you don't want to use my patterns, that is fine. If you just wanted some free embroidery supplies, congratulations, you got free embroidery supplies. You are also going to find some thread, hopefully in a few different colors, but I'm also going to show you I have created a pattern, or 6 patterns. I'm not entirely sure what people are into nowadays, so I've got a few different options. They will all fit within the embroidery hoop. I have double checked that. So if you want to use these, great. If you don't, if you've got a better pattern for this, by all means. This is all free flowing and free spirited. Most of these patterns you are going to want to, I don't know how to explain this in a way that makes sense. I'm still recent to the cross stitch world, but you want to orient them with each other. So the fish, it doesn't matter where they go. You don't have to copy them directly onto the fabric as you see here. Just wherever they're going to fit and wherever you think they look best. This was just like a way to place them to, if you just want one fish, go for it. It's going to take you like 20 minutes. I highly encourage that. But we've got all sorts of things. I'm going to explain to you a little bit about some of these. Most of these are just, it's your basic cross stitch. You're not going to need to know any more than that. This guy, he's got some funky little cross stitches noted here. If you look close to the eyes, they've got some T's going on and around the nose, and that's going to be a 3/4 stitch. I'm going to show you what that is. It's just going to give it more of a rounded shape instead of just having giant squares for eyeballs for your skull. And just for clarity's sake, the background of the cross stitch, that's going to be the dark color is the background. That's the cloth. You don't have to embroider that. If you've got the floss for it, go ahead. I'm going to copy down a little bit of a pattern, just so you kind of get an idea for how you can do it. I do it a couple different ways. Sometimes I will take the pattern, I'll fold it up into like individual chunks, and then I'll put pins in my fabric. So like here's a 6 chunk set. So I know if I go 6 down and so many over, I'm in the right place. You don't need to necessarily do that for all of these. In fact, for a lot of these, if you just draw on the fabric, I think you're going to get a great effect. But like the fish, I don't even think you need to draw those. You can just start stitching. But we are going to start with a bit of a pattern. Grab your thimble. If you have a thimble, great. If you don't have one, if you want to get into sewing, I highly recommend getting one. Mine is a leather thimble, so it's custom sized. But when you do, if you do decide to get a thimble, which once again, highly recommend, they come in different sizes and they go on your middle finger, and you want to make sure that you can upend your hand and it's not going to fall off. So that's how you know your thimble is the correct size. Mine is a little bit grubby, don't judge me. I do actually use it. So we're gonna get started. You have 6-strand embroidery floss. This is the standard size for all embroidery floss, but what we're gonna do just to extend it out, and because 6 strands is a lot, what you do is you typically take 2 strands of the 6 and you separate them out, and that's what you're going to use for most of your stitches. For the bubbles on my fish over here, I actually use the full 6 strands just to give it a little bit more of a 3-dimensional effect. But for this, most of it, it's just going to be your 2 strands. So now we've got our 2-strand thread. And the nice thing about cross stitching is you never have to knot the end. It's very simple. You just have to bury the thread. So what we're going to do is we've got our little needle here. We are going to go ahead and thread it. And once again, you don't need a particularly fine needle for this. In fact, a bigger needle, especially, something you can get up to 6 strands of embroidery floss through the eye, it's not going to hurt you in the slightest. But I'm going to show you, I believe it's called the Dutch stitch. It is your typical cross stitch pattern. So what you're going to do is you're going to go diagonally one direction, and then you're going to come back the other direction. It makes a very nice, neat back, and I think a large part of the impressiveness of cross stitch is the back looks so neat. Some of us are still learning. But I mean, it's not terrible. I have a vintage embroidery I found at a thrift store, and it just is gorgeous on the back, maybe even more so than the front. So for cross stitch, you just go through one of the holes in the fabric. I'm not sure how well that's going to pick up on the camera, but once you get the fabric in your hands, my goodness, it's just chock-a-block full of holes. So then you go diagonally up or down. Doesn't matter how you start off, but you do want to leave a little bit of a tail in the back of the fabric. And what we're going to do is super nifty. I will show you. Make sure you don't pull the tail through when you do pull that through, but then we're going to go through the back, and you go straight down through the back. Then we see on the back of the fabric, we've got the loop from where we just sewed through, as well as our tail from where the thread went in. We just want to make sure that the loop is over the tail. And you're going to end up sewing down the thread. So you don't really have to worry about it coming loose. It's going to be stitched into your lines. So then we're going to go diagonally up again. And then straight down. Sometimes it takes a little bit to orient yourself in the fabric and make sure you're getting into the right nook. And for the next couple stitches, because my tail was a little bit long, I'm just going to make sure that it's still getting tucked in the back. And it just gives it a bit of a neater appearance. And once again, keeps your thread nice and stable. Okay, we've reached the end of our row. That's as far as we're going. And what we're going to do is we're going to go straight down, just like we're going to make another stitch, but we're going to start going in the other direction. So you end up with a little X. Don't worry if your thread gets a little bit tangled. Just try to make sure you get it before it gets too tight. And you can usually pick it out with your needle. Right, once again, straight back down and diagonal once again. So here we are back at the beginning. Obviously you are going to have a bit more of a pattern, and it's probably not going to end up looking absolutely perfect. Like if you look on the back, these are these gorgeous little straight lines. Aside from the thread that we tucked in. That's for all of the weird angles in these patterns that may not happen all the way through. That's okay. You can do some diagonals. I'm giving you permission. Maybe don't entirely take it from me. I'm still new at this once again. But to bury our thread, we are going to go in and we're just going to pick up the stitches. It's basically just like when we started our row, only we are going through the loops as they're taught now. And you take your scissors. If you use little embroidery scissors, it's probably better for this. I only have my big chompers that are highly overpowered for this. But that is your basic cross stitch. That is your Dutch. It's not my prettiest work, but that is super simple, super fast as far as needlework goes. I'm also going to show you the English stitch, which sometimes when you're moving in like a diagonal might be a bit easier. All right, same thing, make sure we've got our tail, but with the English stitch, you are doing one stitch at a time. So you're doing a full complete stitch. And then moving on to the next one. It doesn't look quite as pretty on the back side, so that's why typically people use, once again, I believe it's the Dutch stitch. I could be entirely wrong. If I'm lying to you, I'm deeply sorry. But I am self-taught and I'm not the best teacher. So you have your entire little cross, then you are going to go over and it's good if you're working in like sort of a diagonal way. So typically if you're going to just do a long row, the Dutch stitch is faster. It makes more sense to use, but this is also just fine. And if it's what you prefer, great. But there's a little row of English stitches. You can't see quite as well because I did not do a great job burying my thread here. Clip off the old tail. But you can see it's not just the same little lines as this previous stitch that you can see here. There's a little bit more of a funky action going on in the back. Which is not a terrible thing. If that's gonna work better for you, it's gonna work better for you. And we just bury the tail the same way as before. And you have learned your basic cross stitches. We are also going to go over a couple different stitches. I'm mostly gonna just include what I've got in my patterns here. There are a ton more stitches, more than even I know. I know barely any. So we are going to just start with a little bit of a cross stitch, and I'm going to, this one's going to come in handy on my Jolly Roger pattern. Called the 3/4 stitch, and you are not going through the entire cross. It's just part of it. It's a perfectly acceptable stitch. I did look it up. But even if it wasn't, we can be a little bit rebellious while doing cross stitches. That's what they're for after all. Okay, got our tail tied down. Okay, so for our 3/4 stitch, we are going to go into the fabric, and instead of going all the way through to the other side, we are just going to go about halfway through. So basically the center point of the little square you're stitching over, you're going to go inside that. And then you are going to go over top, you go down or up, whichever you prefer, whichever is going to work easiest in your pattern. And then you are going to do the full stitch over it. So instead of having a whole entire cross, you have just got, it's a little triangle. So you've only got like half the square covered. It's just going to give it a little bit more of a rounded appearance, which is, I think, quite nice. So we are also going to do a couple just normal stitches. I'm going to show you the running stitch. You don't necessarily have to follow the squares on your cloth for these actual sewing stitches. These are just more to make it look neat and clean. So we are going to go up through the back of our fabric, take the needle, we're going back, and then coming up through the front. And this just makes it a really nice clean line. And then we are going in through the first place we came out. We're going back once again, and then forward, and then back once again. This is an excellent stitch for when you are just actually sewing. It's very strong, very sturdy, but it does make a very nice clean line. So I've got some stitch marks. So if there's like a bold, wide line in the pattern, that's implied that if you want to, you can stitch there. So that's mostly to separate the teeth on the Jolly Roger, and I think there's a railing on the lighthouse that I have patterned. So that is your basic running stitch, or your back stitch. I'm going to show you your basic running stitch, and it's just back and forth. It's going to leave gaps, and it's not the strongest stitch, but it does the job. You go in to the back of your fabric, out through the front. Quite easy. All right, we're going to turn it here. Right, and I'm going to try and show you the stem stitch. So we're going to go up 2 from where we are, up 2 squares. We are going to want to go through actually the center of the thread. We are not actually going through the thread, but we are going to the side of it. And you're always going to want to stay on the same side when you're doing a stem stitch. And then we're going up 1 again. And once again, going up through the center. And it's going to just make a very neat continuous line. But with the stem stitch, you're getting a very solid stitch in a straight line. It's very nice, very orderly. So if you want to give your lobster a little mustache, I think a stem stitch is an excellent way to go. And we are also going to take a look at the split stitch, which is very similar to the stem stitch. So you make your first stitch just the same, but we are actually coming up through the stitch this time. So actually through the thread. And back in again. And back through the middle of the thread. But this also gives it a very solid line. It just looks a little bit different to the stem stitch. It's a matter of preference, and especially if you're working in a dark thread, it doesn't super matter anyway. For our purposes, it might for other purposes. I'm also going to show you the chain stitch if I can remember how to do that offhand. You're going to pull through your fabric. Then go back through the same hole that you just came out of. It seems counterintuitive, and usually, yes, it will just slip through, but as we're doing the chain stitch real quick, you leave a loop before you pull through entirely. And then you go in through the same hole you came out once again. And this is just going to give you a little continuous chain of loops. So chain stitch. Chain stitch is going to just leave you with it's going to look basically like a running stitch on the back. So you can just sew and weave your way through those. Or once again, you'll probably, if you're doing one of my patterns, going to be doing this through cross stitches, so you can just weave it into one of these little lines. So I have apparently tried to make this as difficult as possible. I promise it is quite easy. If you like the patterns, go ahead and give them a try. I hope they're a lot of fun. I've made a couple of them myself, and they are a delight. But I am so glad you could be joining us. So I know I haven't done an actual cross stitch that would look good in a frame, but I'm going to show you how to frame it. It's fairly intuitive. And because your pieces of fabric are just a bit smaller than mine, yours should go a bit easier, but you've got a threaded side and a non-threaded side for your embroidery hoop. You want to make sure that your screw goes through the non-threaded side into the threaded side. I know that's kind of just, basic screw etiquette 101, but you just pop your fabric on. And you do this in the beginning if you want to use it as an actual embroidery hoop where you pull things taut. With this fabric, it's not necessary. It is highly starched. So you probably aren't going to need the tension that an embroidery hoop will typically provide. And that's usually what they're for, is providing tension. We don't need that for most of this, just because this fabric is stiff. So you're going to tighten it as much as you can. Make sure that your cloth is pulled taut as well. And it might take a little bit more finagling if you've already done your cross stitch. And then what you'll do is you will just trim off the back. And you should be good to go as long as you're not fiddling with it too much. It'll stay as it is. It makes a great little wall hanging. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope you have fun during our summer reading program.